do it this way. Thank you. And I thank you all for having us here. I'm going to talk about Hinduism in Houston. In Houston, as of the last count in 2015, there are 120,000 Hindus and 70 Hindu organizations who work under an umbrella also called the Hindus of Greater Houston, which Reverend Hahn referred to. They're actually celebrating a festival this evening at the George Brown Convention Center called Janmashtami. So if you'd like to have a look at all the Hindu traditions in Houston, you're welcome to go there. The Hindu culture, as you know, is very vast, and the term Hinduism encompasses numerous theologies, philosophies, religious traditions, and spiritual cultures. It is a complex, sophisticated tradition, and is likened by some scholars to be like a banyan tree. Does anyone have an experience of a banyan tree? Okay, some people do. So as you know, the banyan tree has a root, and it has a trunk, and the branches come out, and the branches then go down and root again, and form another trunk from which other branches come, which root. And in this way, the tree has many branches, many trunks, and many roots. In Calcutta, there is a very famous banyan tree which extends over an area of 1 mile. So it is hard to say which is the original. But the Vedic scriptures describe the absolute truth in the Bhagavad Purana. And therefore, sometimes we say that dialogue with Hindu tradition is sometimes difficult because there is no official representative of the Hindu faith. It is so diverse and pluralistic. So Vedic scriptures, though, describe the absolute truth, as we said. And in the Vedas, there is no term called Hindu. The term Hindu was actually given by the Muslims who lived north of a river called Sindhu. And since they could not say this as very well, so they called them Hindus. So whoever lived south of the Sindhu river came to be known as Hindus. And that's how the term is derived. But our tradition is called Sanatan Dharma, like Greg referred to. Sanatan means eternal. Dharma is the duty or position, or what is the constitutional duty of the soul, and that is Hinduism, basically. So the Vedic Bhagavad Purana describes the absolute truth in 3 aspects. And in the Sanskrit it goes, Vadanti tat tattva vidas, tattvat yad jnanam advayam, brahmeti paramatmeti, bhagavan iti shabdyate. Translation, learned transcendentalists who know the absolute truth call this non-dual substance Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So there is an understanding that the absolute truth exists as an all-pervading energy or light, you can say, which is the personal glow of the Lord. And that is one understanding of the absolute truth. Then there's another understanding of the absolute truth as the localized super soul who accompanies every living entity in their hearts. And that would be like the Paramatma we call within the heart. And then beyond that is the supreme personal entity of God, a supreme personal God, who is both male, or we call Purush, and female, or his energetic form, which is called Shakti. So in that sense, God is both the male and his energy, the feminine part, or father and mother God. This is the tradition of Hinduism. And therefore, you'll see many temples in Houston, some of whom are just dedicated to worshipping God as the father and mother, like we have at our ISKCON society, father and mother God, Radha and Krishna, or Ram and Sita. Or you may have those dedicated to the Shakti, or to the energy or the feminine aspect of God. Like we have the Durga temple here, we have the Ashtalakshmi temple, which their focus is more on the feminine energy of God. And but they all understand, or in Hinduism, the understanding is there that it is a monotheistic religion. There's one God, but he presents himself in many forms, depending on the time and place when he appears. So this example we said about God appearing, or the absolute truth being understood in 3 categories, Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan, is similar to understanding the sun. The sun has three aspects. The sunlight we see, then the sun disk we see in the sky is like the Paramatma, the localized aspect of God. And then on the sun planet, there is a personal deity of God who's in charge of all the affairs. So and each one is complete in itself. And the adherent of each path feels that his understanding of God is satisfying to him. In our tradition, we also say, in the Hindu tradition, the idea is to develop a personal relationship with the Supreme Absolute Truth through either meditation or through yoga or through the devotional practice like we do. And this relationship is an embodiment of our loving relationship with God. We are all eternal souls or living entities, and the soul by nature is eternal, blissful, and full of love. And he gets fulfillment when he establishes his relationship with God. And this relationship with God can be in 5 flavors. The first flavor is neutrality, like the grass and the trees. They serve by offering, say, fruits and flowers. Then there's the flavor of servitorship, like one can worship God as servant and master. He is the master and we serve him like a servant. Or it can be friendship. We can have friendship with the Absolute, with God. We can be friends, or more on an equal level. Or there is also the paternal relationship, that in the paternal relationship, the devotee feels that God is actually a child, and we take care of him like we take care of a child. And finally, the conjugal relationship. In the Christianity, you have the idea of bridal mysticism. So we also have that tradition in our Hindu faith. So those are some of the ways in which the relationship is developed. And the idea of love is service. Because if there is love, then we have to serve. And therefore, in these different relationships, we serve God in different ways. So the Hindu faith, as Reverend Han said, is very pluralistic. We understand that the soul is always, they're all equal. It is not that I have a Hindu soul, someone has a Christian soul, someone has an Islamic soul. The soul is by nature spiritual, and his dharma, or his constitutional position, is that he has to serve. And service is an expression of our love. And the highest understanding, or the perfection of our life is to develop that relationship with God. So that is what basically Hinduism teaches. And as Hindus, we don't say that we have a monopoly on God, that God, in the Bhagavad Gita, which is our basic Bible, Krishna is our name for God. He says, and I will read from the Bhagavad Gita, that it is not a fact that the Lord appears only on Indian soil. He can manifest himself anywhere and everywhere, and whenever he desires to appear. In each and every incarnation, he speaks as much about religion as can be understood by the particular people under their particular circumstances. But the mission is the same, to lead people to God consciousness and obedience to the principles of religion. Sometimes he descends personally, like Krishna. Sometimes he sends his bona fide representative in the form of his son, like Jesus Christ or Muhammad, or servant, or he himself sometimes comes in a disguised form. So God can incarnate or come in any form to spread his mission. We also have the understanding that it is not that we have this relationship in our tradition, but we also respect any other faith which doesn't have a personal form of God. So any communities or organizations which advocate humanitarian, ethical, and moral standards are also valued as being beneficial to society, and and we view dialogue with people of these faiths as being very valuable. And we follow the basic principles of human civilization. We call them the 4 regulative principles, which basically are very similar across all religions in terms of developing mercy, truthfulness, cleanliness, and austerity. And one of the things which sometimes confuses people is that we have, it seems like the Hindus worship multiple gods. It is so the part of Hinduism which says that God is just an absolute light or energy. They obviously do not have forms that they worship, but the other tradition, the other path of Hinduism which has a God, like a personal forms, these forms are carved according to Vedic scriptures, and they are representatives of the Supreme Lord, according to our scriptures. It is just like, you know, you have the post office, and then you have the mailboxes. The mailbox serves the same function as the post office. If you put your letter in the mailbox, it goes to the post, it goes to its destination. So these forms, we call them Arsha Vigraha or Murtis. These are not just graven images. These are forms of the Lord which are carved according to scripture. We invite the Lord to inhabit those forms, and then we offer our service in that way. So that is why we worship sometimes forms or deities. But like Greg was showing, in Arya Samaj, in that particular school, which is the impersonalist school, there is no form or deity they worship. It is more a meditation on the absolute energy of the Lord. So as we said, it is very broad and diverse. And then I will finally end with something which I thought we could share, since this is an interfaith event. It is from the 10th canto of the Bhagavad Purana in a book called The Light of the Bhagavad. And it is a message for us for action. In this age of a godless civilization, the sages of world-recognized religious sects who believe in God must come out of their secluded places and preach the science of God, the supreme will, to the people in general. Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and the members of other sects that have convincing faith in the authority of God must not sit idly now and silently and watch the rapid growth of a godless civilization. There is the supreme will of God, and no nation or society can live in peace and prosperity without acceptance of this vital truth. The warning is already there, and responsible leaders of religious sects, like you all are here, we must meet and together bring the message of God to the people in general so we can have peace and prosperity in our lives. This is the teaching of our founder, Srila Prabhupada. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. I'm going to turn on my own stopwatch so I can just have it in front of me. It helps holding myself accountable. I'm going to start with a quote from a teacher of mine in seminary, a rabbi in his late 70s or early 80s. We weren't really sure. And he always, I think he probably looked that way for his whole life. But he was a short man, very feisty. Lenny Kravitz, his name, not to be confused with the rock star. And he had grown up he'd gone to a Jesuit school as a prep school. Any Jesuits here today? Probably mostly. Yeah, there you go. So when as I understand, if you are ordained, or I don't know exactly the term for becoming Jesuit or receiving orders, I don't know the right language, I'm probably using the wrong terms, but you get an SJ after your name, Society of Jesus. And so Rabbi Kravitz liked to say SJ, in his case meant small Jew. That was what he, but what he said to us that's actually relevant for today is that he often said, he was our professor of medieval Jewish philosophy, but he liked to say, Jews are just like everybody else, only more so. So that I'll provide as my introduction for talking about Judaism in Houston and Jews in Houston. I want to do a little bit of history and then a snapshot of where we are right now. And if we have time, and maybe in the panel, some challenges as we look to the future of Jewish life in Houston. I'm not going to touch that much on theology. Happy to do that if you have questions about it later. So we know that there were Jews in the Houston area as far back as the 1830s. In 1840, a prominent Jewish businessman was part of founding the Chamber of Commerce here in Houston. In 1850, there were 17 Jewish adults in Houston. A lot of this is new to me too. In 1854, a group of Jews bought land for a cemetery, and that is often when there's a big enough population of Jews in a place, one of the first things they do when they get organized is buy land for a cemetery. You could do a whole other conversation about why they weren't buried in the same cemetery as the other people. That's an interesting topic actually for a multi-faith gathering, partly that Jews had a rule to be only buried among other Jews, and probably they weren't allowed in the other cemeteries anyway, so there's a lot we could probably learn from that. But at any rate, in 1856, what they had founded as the Hebrew Benevolent Aid Association, and they used the word Hebrew because at the time that was sort of the polite word for, that was the mainstream word for Jews in America. In the 19th century, you called us Hebrews. And so the Hebrew Benevolent Aid Association, which existed, versions of that all over the country, which helped to run the cemetery and provide aid to those in need, Jewish and otherwise, was invited to be in the July 4th parade in Houston, 1856. In 1859, Beth Israel was founded, the first congregation, the first synagogue in Houston, by 32 men. And at that time, it had separate seating for men and women, which was a more traditional form. And they, I think, tried to require their members to close their businesses on Shabbat. And that led to a lot of contention, actually. And at one point, they tried to make it a condition for membership, and naturally that led to splinter groups. And by 1874, Beth Israel joined the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which now today is called the Union for Reform Judaism, the denomination. So, just like among Christianity in America, denominationalism is alive and well, and started early. In 1870, though, jumping back a few years, Beth Israel built their first building at the corner of Crawford and Franklin. Kind of a picture where I think it's a parking lot for Minute Maid Park now. But there was downtown right over there. And I'll come back to the geography of where Jewish Houston lives has been an interesting evolution. In 1887, a bunch of traditional members left this now Reform synagogue and started a more Orthodox community. Many of them were Eastern Europeans who were leaving the more German community that was the root of the Reform population in America, not just in Houston, but all over the country. That, what I'll call maybe early and middle 19th century immigration of Jews was mostly German, Austrian, and then later on shifted to Eastern European. And they did not get along when they got here, typically. It's funny to think about now, but really tense divisions between those ethnic communities. So Eastern Europeans split off and founded another synagogue in 1891, which eventually, through several other splinters and mergers, became Beth Yeshurun. And that's known as a conservative synagogue over on Beechnut. Another thing that changed the Jewish makeup of Houston very significantly was the Galveston movement as immigration got shifted through the port of Galveston, and then the hurricane, which destroyed what was a vibrant community in Galveston and moved a lot of the Jewish community and otherwise to Houston. Put Houston on the map in some ways, actually, broadly, not just the Jewish community. Further from that, I won't get into too many of the details, but the presence of the question of Zionism became a divisive issue among Jewish community in the early 20th century. Classical Reform Judaism at the time was very avowedly non-Zionist, but anti-Zionist. I don't know the right term for it since it's pre-Israel. Israel didn't exist yet, but it was non-Zionist in that it had this vision of itself as a non-tribal universal religion that was here in America to do its mission of being a light to the nations, or lagoyim, as Isaiah called us to be. So they were pretty committed to not having a national return with political sovereignty in the land of Israel. That led to a really contentious congregational meeting in the 40s, I believe it was, when at Beth Israel, which was the classical Reform synagogue, 140-something families left along with Rabbi Robert Kahn and went and founded Emmanuel, which is where I grew up. And Rabbi Kahn, I think he was actually then, he went off to the war and was a fighter pilot in World War II and came back and helped found Emmanuel as the founding rabbi. And so back to the geography a little bit. In the 1920s and 30s, Jews lived mostly in Washington and Riverside Terrace areas. My sort of personal story reflects that in the sense that my mother was born and raised in Houston. Her parents were both immigrants from Eastern Europe and moved to this country as children, landed in Texas because my grandfather wanted to go to medical school, couldn't afford it at the time as an immigrant, and went to veterinary school at Texas A&M. It is no longer the case that vet school is cheaper than medical school. I think it's actually the opposite now, but at the time that was a good option for him, and he started an animal clinic in Houston, and that was his whole career. So and they lived, when they first lived here, they lived on Prospect Street, a spot which is now 288. It's now under 288. And then in the 50s, like many white Americans in those neighborhoods, they moved, not my parents, but not my mom, but a lot of the Jewish community moved southwest toward Meyerland and the Braeswood areas, North and South Braeswood. And that is also when many of the Jewish organizations moved southwest. So that's why the JCC is there. That's why Beth Israel is now there. That's why, Beth Yeshurun ended up building there. UOS, the Union of United Orthodox Synagogues, the modern Orthodox synagogue, is there, although they just knocked down their building, which I'll get to in a moment when we talk about post-Harvey. So that's why a lot of people think about, when you think about Jewish Houston, you think about Meyerland and the Braeswood area. It was really the 50s when that started. So one thing I like about this, just thinking about the snapshot of history, is that the idea of historically Jewish Houston is such a malleable idea that changes every generation, it seems like, or maybe every 2 generations. By the 1970s, the majority of Jews lived in Meyerland, Bel Air, and Braeswood areas. That's not the case anymore, but I think by we I mean Jews internally, and also I think Houstonians typically think that that's where most Jews live, even though that is no longer the case. I'll come back to that in a moment too. One other sort of personal note to some of the history. My grandmother was the Hebrew tutor for a woman named Theba Feldman, who still lives in Houston. Some of you may know Theba, and Buster Feldman. They have been very involved in philanthropy in Houston and Jewish causes and other causes, and very civically involved. Theba was the first bat mitzvah in Houston, meaning the first girl to have that ceremony. And my grandmother was her Hebrew tutor. This is a little snapshot through my lens of Houston Jewish history. Now, looking ahead. So, if you want to know more about the history, there's actually a great entry in the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. There's an entry on Houston, if you want to know more of the details. It's really interesting stuff. Also a little bit about when the KKK was especially active here in the 1920s and how the Jewish community reacted to that. And now I'm turning to some results numbers from a commissioned study by the Jewish Federation in 2016, which is interesting because it's before Harvey. They have some data on the Memorial Day floods in here, but it happened before Harvey. But the summary is 145 pages. So I'm just going to give you a few snapshots. It's a little bit mind-numbing when you look too closely at it, but it's the biggest study, I think it's the only study maybe, of Houston Jewry since 1986. And so it gives us some sense of where Jews are and what we look like. One thing to note, I think we just heard there are 120,000 Hindus in Houston. Did I get the number right? If I remembered it right. So there are about 51,000 Jews in Houston. But it's a little more interesting than that because there are like 64,000 people living in Jewish households in Houston, but only 51,000 Jews. That actually gets to a really interesting challenge, opportunity, just reality that we're looking at, which is heightened rates of intermarriage, but that doesn't even explain all the contours of the issue, because now you have, more than probably ever in history, not just in Houston but everywhere, in America at least, a situation of more non-Jews living in Jewish households than ever before. And we, as sort of Jewish organizations or Jewish establishment, don't really have the vocabulary for that yet. Although it's very interesting that there was a newspaper article about some of those 19th century synagogues in Houston that referred to them as, like, Friday night at Beth Israel was a place where Jew and Gentile are to be found alike, enjoying celebrating this institution of the city. Interesting way of thinking about it. So about 51,000 Jews, but 64,000 people living in Jewish households. Houston is the 32nd largest Jewish community in the United States. And the Jews are about 1.4% of all households in the metro area that they studied for this study anyway. So this was eye-opening to me because, again, we have an assumption of where we think Jews live. But 24% live in the following 3 zip codes. So think of it, about a quarter of Jews live in the following 3 zip codes. 77096, which is basically Meyerland. 77479, we know where that is? Sugar Land, yes. And 77401, which is basically Bel Air. So that's only a quarter. The 3 places, Sugar Land's probably newer, but Bel Air and Meyerland are the places we all think that's where Jews live. It's less than a quarter. So that's a huge change from what a lot of us thought. A couple other just interesting numbers. About 6% of Jewish adults consider themselves Hispanic Jews. About 9% are Israelis. About 13% are Sephardic Jews. And there's overlap between those groups too, so they're not exclusive. Okay, there's a couple other details I wanted to just mention. I have like a minute left, I think. Just about denominations and affiliation rates. So Jews in Houston identifying with denominations, about only 4% identify as Orthodox, 24% are about a quarter as conservative, 1% Reconstructionists. If you've never heard of that or want to know what that is, ask me, it's really interesting. And the least known, I think. 37% Reform, which is what I am, and 33% just Jewish, which was a huge increase from the last time they asked the question. That, I would say, is a great example of Rabbi Kravitz's statement, Jews are just like everybody else, only more so, that just like across the country, Americans are identifying less and less with denominations, even if they identify as a religious kind of person. Think of it, the rise of the nuns, or whatever, that's N-O-N-E-S, whatever frame you use to look at it. That's true in the Jewish community as well. The thing I'll stop on for now is one I find to be so fascinating, well, 2 things. One, just quickly, that I think it's interesting for you to know, that only 44% of households are members of a synagogue. 44% of Jewish households. And that's pretty average across the country, pretty close to the average. But just to end on a couple thoughts. Maybe just one as a kind of headline. 97% of respondents say they're proud to be Jewish. 97%. If you're in the industry of building Jewish life or organizing Jewish programming, that's an amazing number to be working with. So even when we look at a lot of these numbers of dwindling affiliation rates and lack of denominational identity and all these, 97% are proud of this identity. That's an amazing number, actually. And there's a lot of opportunity in that, I think, from our perspective as trying to organize Jewish community. What we do with that and what it looks like, we can get to a little bit later. Harvey has thrown a wrench into a lot of it because so many of the Jewish institutions in the neighborhood that I talked about, the JCC and 3 synagogues at least, flooded very badly during Harvey, and some of them it was the 3rd time. So there's big questions about what that means for us going forward. Is that still a place that we can stay? Can we even afford to move? Where are Jews living if not there? Answer is all over the city. And what do we do with that? So I'll leave on those questions and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, so I was kind of worried because, a doctor and a Princeton grad, and then they're like, oh, hey, you should go up next. This will be a great idea. So thank you for having me. I'm a native Houstonian, which I know amongst a lot of people in the room is not very exciting, but as a Sikh, it's a pretty big deal. So that also makes me the self-appointed know-it-all for Houston Sikhs. So that's why I'm here to give you the information and background on Sikhs in Houston. We're not a very organized group, so we don't have the statistics or the consensus that we can kind of monitor our people. And so I can tell you, just because my family was one of the first Sikh families here in Houston, I've just got that whole trajectory that I can work off of and tell you what my parents have told me and things like that. It's kind of like ancient Indian, and I mean American Indian, not Indian Indian, where you tell the story that passes down from generation to generation. So shockingly, there's this huge immigration debate right now. But back in the 60s and 70s, the government looked at America and said, hey, we're too white. What's going on here? And so they wanted to diversify America. And they went to other countries and they handed out green cards to people that were successful and had professional licenses. And they said, come to America. It's a great place. And so my parents and 10 other families from Houston were one of those influx of people where my dad, incidentally, he wasn't married at the time. He was a bachelor hanging out in Bombay, now Mumbai. And this guy approached him and said, here's a green card. Why don't you come? You guys are architects. We need y'all. So they did that because he wasn't married, so he didn't care. And so he moved to the United States. And he actually initially did the bachelor thing, went to Miami, and then ultimately settled here, because of NASA and Bechtel and all the rest that we've got here. But when he came here, literally there were only 10 families that were of Sikh origin. And for a while, because this is the late 60s, early 70s, we would join in with our Hindu brothers and sisters and kind of worship with them because we were just looking for our own kind. And that slowly developed into meeting into other people's homes. And from the homes, they decided, you know what, we kind of need a facility so we can meet. We got to go somewhere because everybody else is busy on Wednesday and Sundays. We got to figure something out for ourselves. So they did. They bought this old rickety house, and it's kind of in an interesting fix. So our very first place of worship, which we call a gurdwara, and gur means teacher. Dwara is like the house. So we go to our place of worship to learn from our teacher, to learn something. And there are many ways in which that manifests itself when you're actually worshiping. So there's things that we're doing that introduces that piece of teaching at all points in times where we have to kind of say, okay, I'm bowing my head because I'm letting information in. Okay, I'm saying something back to you because I'm saying I understand what you just said to me. So there's a lot, that concept is really huge. I digress. So we bought this piece of land and this itty-bitty rickety house off of 290 and Winfern. Have you guys ever been in that area? Okay. We bought it next to a trailer park. That was kind of scary in the 70s. So we bought this one little house and met week after week. And I was born, so this happened while I was there. Not like mentally, but I was physically alive. It burned down after a year of it being there. And so literally the community at this point had grown to like 20, 25 people. And so they, in 1977, I just aged myself. Anyway, they built the actual structure that's there now. And because my dad was like such a big into like cameras and photography, I actually have the footage of these elder people. Well, they're elder now. They were young then. They were building it with their bare hands, like literally the wood structures and all, because they were poor. They came with $8 because that's what the US government gave you when you entered in the US. So they built this new structure and it still sits there in Northwest Houston. So because that was our community center and Gurdwara that we went to every week, that became the hub of Sikhs. So the majority of Sikhs in Houston live on the northwest side of town. And from that Gurdwara, we also have additional Gurdwaras because our population has grown. Now, while we're the 5th largest religion, I think, and we don't have statistics, but I think that our numbers are about 5,000, which you felt like it was dismal that you had only 44,000. I'm like, oh my God, one day we'll be there. But we're only at 5,000 now. And we're all working on I was a first generation immigrant because my parents, and then we're working on our second generation. So at one point we'll be a part of that diversity melting pot of Houston that we have the multi-faith culture. Now, being the 5th largest religion in the world, what sounds fantastic, but we were so busy when we came to America that we were assimilating and trying to figure out where we belong in this, that we forgot to tell people that we exist, right? So how many people even know what Sikhs are in this room? I should have done my Sikhism 101, okay. So you guys know, right, like Sikh, S-I-K-H. So people are like, why do you all say Sikhs? Well, we said it because people would confuse it with Sikh, like I'm nauseous, which we don't want you to feel like that about us. So we're saying Sikhs. So just broad overview, and we can go over like the intricate details, but I'm kind of scared of Priscilla. But just a broad overview, we're a monotheistic religion. We believe in hardcore equality. And when the reason I say hardcore is because it's for men and women. So whatever men do, women do. I have long hair, so do the men in our religion. They wear turbans, we cover our head when we go to our place of worship. We don't take on the last name of our husbands or our fathers because we are women, we gave birth to them. So that is, when I say hardcore equality, it's a big deal because our religion was formed in 1462, and that was not an option in East Asia at the time. So it was a big deal. We don't have societal class forms. We do not believe in your segmented societal class. We believe literally everybody's equal. And so when you come to Gurdwara, you'll see everybody sits on the floor, everybody eats on the floor, free meals, yes, you heard it right. Every single time. So we all sit equal base, so you don't even know if you're sitting next to the millionaire next door or somebody on food stamps. You're that equal in the eyes of God. And so we have those little things, nuances in our minds at all times when we're worshiping. So that's the 101 part of Sikhism. But the reason why I bring up why a lot of people don't know about us is because we're caught up in the assimilation thing. This shook our world. Of course we dealt with, I remember specifically growing up in the 80s when the whole Iraq thing was going on and being out in our front yard and my dad, my turban father standing next to me and we're just like mowing the lawn because child labor is okay for us. And people would drive by and scream out, go back to Iraq. And we're like, yeah, so about that. So, we've always kind of gotten that whole deal, right? It's manageable because everybody kind of goes through their versions of discrimination growing up in America. But in 2012, because our Gurdwaras are open spaces and we have food and people come in and we want people to learn, they're learning centers, a white supremacist came into our premises in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. He walked around for 30 minutes, nobody said a word to him because that's how it works. Opened fire and shot 6 people. So it was the first time that a place of worship, now I know that it happened later on in Charleston, but it was the first time a place of worship had been targeted in that manner for our type of, our Sikhs. And so to us, we were like, oh my God, that was a big one for us. And the reason that was big was because we already had this oh crap moment in 2001 when the World Trade Center went down and they put images of Osama bin Laden. What does Osama bin Laden look like? He looks like my brother, my son, my dad. He looks like a Sikh. And I don't think that Muslims should have hate crimes done to them either. I'm not ever like, we're not Muslims, because that's not fair. Nobody should have any type of hate crime done against them. But that was one of our opening moments of like, we need to let people know who we are so that we're not associated with the Al-Qaeda network. that's a big deal. And it was something that we had pushed forward as a Houstonian. We got onto, Dominique Sasha, Channel 2, Channel 13. We're doing the town halls telling people this is what a sick is, just so you know. We're all about service. We're all about giving back to our community. We're all about giving out our money to the poor, and we're all about equality. So we started to talk about those things so people knew who we were. And then that's why the 2012 thing was still a big shock to us, because we were still making this concerted effort to let people know who we are, because we don't do missionaries, so it was never something on our radar. But then it became an information education piece that we needed to do for our safety. And we started doing that since then. How am I on time? Because I'm so scared. Okay, thank God. Yeah, so we've now started to go out to these places, and that's why I know it sounds cliche to be like, I'm so appreciative of this. And to some degree, we're preaching to the choir, right? Because you guys clearly care about this. You're here for a reason. But if you leave with these tidbits, this information pieces of, oh my God, that guy, when somebody is in an airplane, and this happened to my boss, real true story, and a sick gets up from his chair, and people start unclicking their seatbelts, and the lady next to you says, oh shit, you ready? You will have that information piece to say, that's a sick. I don't know what you're worried about. They're not gonna bomb this plane. True story, he stopped somebody from thinking like that. And I think that that's the piece that makes me so happy when I can come to places like this and say, hey, this is our truth, this is who we are, and this is where we stand and where we come from, so that way you're able to pass that message along. Again, preaching to the choir, right? Can I get an amen? I've always wanted to say that. Thank you guys for your time.
Actually, while they're putting a PowerPoint up for Sharik, can I just ask you, because she's afraid of me, so I can do this. So 1462, can you just give us a reason why, while Tim is setting up the PowerPoint, why it was founded?
Yeah. Okay, so our original founder's name was Guru Nanak Dev Ji, and Guru meaning teacher. So we don't have a person that we worship. We do worship a one God, and we think similar to exactly what the doctor was saying. We believe that God flows through each and every one of us, and it's one and the same. We call it different words, different names, but literally like including leaves and trees and everything. Like we've got that same energy, and so we should respect our world and everything. So our first original Guru, Guru Nanak Dev Ji, who started the religion, he was actually born into a Hindu family. And his sister was older than him, and he absolutely adored her. And they were close, and they were fantastically perfect. And he was a part of the highest caste within the Hindu culture, which is called Brahmin. So because he was the male in the family, he was able to participate in sort of rituals and things that kind of anointed him as the next Brahmin to carry it out. And I may be misspeaking a little bit because I'm not 100% familiar with how it works with the Hindu customs. But what his questioning is, how come my sister isn't getting this? And why am I a Brahmin? And why am I going to remain a Brahmin? And why am I any different than the people that are in other castes? So it was that thought process or questioning and that time period in which the religion was, so to speak, born. And he talked about, there's lines in our scripture, na ko Hindu, na ko Musliman. Like there is no such thing as a Hindu, there is no Musliman, there's no Sikh, we're all the same. We all love, pray, and are all one being, and so we should always continue to think like that. So that's kind of the spawn of what had started the revolution, so to speak, and it has grown from there. And each guru has kind of added their mark as to what are important values and traditions, and we have a huge sense of democracy within our religion. So there's a code of conduct that we have, and that's when you see the Sikhs with the way that we look, our uniform, our last names, and then we have the other part which we call the Khalsa Panth, and the Panth is a group of Sikhs where we vote on things that matter to us. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that are up to the Khalsa Panth right now is if we should become vegetarian, because it's against our religion just to eat halal meat, which is just the meat sacrificed in the name of God. because we think that you should eat meat for purposes of eating for the food cycle. And so that's like one of the things that the Kalsapanth opines on. So those are the type of issues that we have, like a democratic system as well that's instituted for our religion. So each part of our gurus has kind of added another layer. And that same thing I mentioned to you about the free food, that was added by our 5th guru. And it was really done for the purposes of feeding the homeless. So if you go to India, you go to England, you go to these Canada, you go to heavily populated, sick areas in the world, you'll see that that's actually going on 24/7. In Houston, we just feed ourselves, which is not very helpful. But we still have that ongoing. It's a religious tradition that we always have food at the end of any single ceremony. So even if it's at home or anywhere else, that's what we do.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I accidentally went to St. Luke's this morning, and when I arrived there was no one there except I walked around asking folks, where's the where's the panel at, where's the seminar, and I was just getting confused looks and saying that's tomorrow. Anyhow, so then I got in the truck and I got here as fast as possible. Anyhow, thank you for having me. This is a wonderful program, and I don't know how I'm supposed to go up after Manpreet, because that was just such an awesome presentation, but I'm going to do my best. So just as Manpreet had said, in 1965 there was a new immigration act that passed by LBJ. And that's what really opened the door to a population surge of Muslims from all around the world. So now it wasn't just Europeans coming into America, but now it was Pakistanis, Indians, Bengalis, Nepalese, Chinese, Vietnamese, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone had an equal opportunity to get into America if you were able to do so. My parents arrived in Houston my father came in 1971 to study in Miami. He started off with the bachelor route at Florida International. My mom followed much later in 1976. My parents came from Pakistan for education and for prosperity because my grandfather on my mother's side was a businessman, and business in New York City it was just booming. It was exploding. So that New York City was the place to be for my mother's side of the family. In Houston, the Muslim community really took off right around 1965, when the first students from Pakistan and India came here and they established a mosque. Now, most of you know that there's Sunnis and Shias, and generally speaking, Sunnis and Shias pray in different mosques. But there are so few of us in Houston, in America, generally speaking, that everyone prayed at the same mosque. They all met at the same time. They ate at the same restaurant, if there was a restaurant, and everyone sort of knew each other. It was this Mayberry in Houston type feel where every Muslim sort of knew another Muslim, right? Now, Muslims, as you know, have been in America for much longer than the 60s. In fact, scholars say that 20 to 30% of slaves who arrived, especially from West Africa, were Muslim. And because Muslims, as they were slaves, had to practice their Islam in private and secret, well, Islam was lost amongst the slaves over a long amount of time. You also know that Muslims fought in the Revolutionary War against the British. You also know that the longest treaty that America has still to this day is actually with Morocco, not with France or England or Germany or anyone else. It's actually with a Muslim nation, which is pretty interesting. Islam in Houston started in the 60s because students who came from Pakistan and India needed a place to pray and congregate. They went to the University of Houston. They had to do Friday prayers. They had to do funeral services. They had to pray Eid together, which is one of two celebrations that we have throughout the year as Muslims. And because of that common need, they got together and they formed a society called the Islamic Society of Greater Houston. I'm not sure if any of you, most of the mosques in Houston, many of the larger mosques in Houston are owned by the Islamic Society of Greater Houston. Our demographics, since the first Muslim Students Association of Houston, a strong 8 PhD candidates, has now gone up to almost 200,000 to 300,000. There's no official count yet, but the numbers will be between 200,000 to 300,000 Muslims in Houston of all ages. Pew did a poll actually in 2017 which said 58% of Muslims in this country are actually immigrants. The rest of the percentage are folks like me, second generation, third generation, and now fourth generation Muslims who are growing up assimilating or integrating into this country and growing up here in America, not knowing anything else other than, well, America. Because if I were to go to Pakistan, Pakistanis would look at me weird and they'd spot me out immediately, right? I would walk out of Karachi airport, I would walk out of Jinnah airport in Karachi, and immediately I'd have a target painted on my back. You know, that's an American, right? That's the guy who you're gonna go swindle. So going into markets was never an easy thing for me whenever I'd go to Karachi or Lahore or Islamabad. Whenever I'd go into one of these markets, my mother would always accommodate me, or my cousins in Pakistan would come with me, and they'd do all the negotiating on my behalf, because my Urdu, which is the national language of Pakistan, it's sort of like Texan Spanish, right? It's like no habla español. Right? That's how I speak Urdu. So the moment I open my mouth, it's like, ooh, we're going to charge him quadruple the price. Right? So, you know, when I was growing up, I distinctly remember an experience. I grew up in Mission Bend in Fort Bend County. We're going to Long John Silver's back when they used to have Long John Silver's. Still the best hush puppies around. There was Long John Silver's on Westheimer and Dairy Ashford, and we're in a nice Chrysler van, and my parents are driving, and on the side of the road was a woman in a sari. A sari is sort of a two-piece traditional Indian dress that women wear, and my parents almost stopped in the middle of Westheimer. They pointed on the side of the road like, "Dekho, desis," meaning, look, there's someone from South Asia. Right? It was just like, wow, there's one of us over here. And this was in the early 80s, by the way. You know, when I was growing up in elementary school, I was the only brown kid in school. No one knew what I was. I often passed off as a Hispanic. When I was in middle school, people would call me an Indian. I'd say, no, I'm not Indian, right? Because at that time, it was still an insult to call me, a Pakistani kid, an Indian. It was, no, I'm not an Indian. I'm Pakistani. And people would say, where's Pakistan? No one had any idea. But after 9/11, everyone knew where Pakistan was, right? Unfortunately. But to see another South Asian, to see another Muslim in Houston, just commonly at the grocery store or at Target or at Kmart, it just never happened. But our population really, really started to grow in the mid-'80s and the early '90s. Now we have well over 100 mosques throughout Houston, 200,000 to 300,000 Muslims. Every major high school in the city has a sizable Muslim Students Association. Every university in the city has a sizable Muslim Students Association. When I say sizable, I mean 100 to 200 kids in the high schools are at these MSAs. At the MSA at U of H, the Muslim Students Association, U of H, you have between 500 to 700 kids who show up every Friday for services. And that's just the first congregant. That's just the first congregation. Second congregation has just as many as well. Our mosques hold anywhere, the average mosque will hold anywhere between 200 to 300 on the smaller size. On the larger side, they'll hold anywhere between 750 to 1,000 congregants. And they're always jam-packed to the end to the sidewalk, to the point where the fire marshal knows our community very well and has cited us multiple times at our places of worship, to where now we don't just have first services, we have first services, second services, third services, and now at some mosques it's becoming fourth services as well, because we just don't have the capacity to hold all the Muslims for Friday services. Texas, by the way, everything is bigger in Texas. Texas has the largest growing population of Muslims throughout the country. And that's because of jobs, that's because of NASA, the medical center, especially here in Houston, the tech hub in Dallas, and also because property prices in Houston are significantly cheaper. Now, a little bit about our problems in Houston and some of the solutions that we're coming to. Like David, I'm not going to talk much about the theology. I really want to focus on who we as Muslims are in Houston, as your neighbors. You know, when immigrants came to Houston, when they came to America, much like my father and mother, they had a Pakistani version of Islam. They had an Indian version of Islam, a Saudi version of Islam, a Bahraini version of Islam, a Persian version of Islam. Much like when Lutherans first came here, they had maybe a German, or I don't think it was Germany at the time, was it? Anyways, what I'm trying to say is everyone had their own ethnic or racial version of their Christianity or of their Judaism. If I understand correct, one of the big problems in Israel when it was first formed was you had Ukrainian Jews, Russian Jews, you had Germanic Jews, you had Austrian Jews, French Jews, and everyone had a different understanding, right? And that's the same thing here in America. When you have all these Pakistanis and Saudis and Kuwaitis and Iraqis come here, everyone practiced Islam differently, according to their own race, according to their own culture, the way their forefathers practiced it, not necessarily according to the way the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, practiced it. Not necessarily according to the way that it's prescribed so in the Quran, because folks just insert their own little interpretation, their own version of it. So when immigrants came here to Houston, you know, the Saudis practice one way, you had the Pakistanis practice one way, and the Indonesians and Bosnians, well, they just practice an entirely different way. Let's not even talk about the Chinese Muslims. That'll just make it way too complex. So when the houses of worship were formed, they reflected individual racial tensions and individual racial identities and outlooks on what Islam was. Growing up, instead of praying 5 times a day, I would pray 5 times a day and an additional 2 or 3 times. My Saudi friend would only pray 5 times a day and said those other 2 or 3 times a day that I would pray would lead me into the hellfire. It was very different. It was very unique. So theology was very complicated. But that's what we call immigrant baggage. Every community that immigrates here to the country, second generation like me, says that their forefathers have immigrant baggage. They come with their own preconceived notions. They come with their own ideas and understanding. But once you hit the ground here in America, because as an American, I'm taught to question everything. I'm taught not to take everything at face value, but to really dive in deeper and think and ask questions for myself. You see, here in Houston, what I really want to emphasize the most, and what I really want you all to walk away with, is here in Houston, here in America, there is an Americanized version of Islam that is emerging with my generation, an American Islam. And that's important for you to understand. How many of you here have heard of American Islam? Okay, just a couple. How many of you here are shocked to hear that there is such a thing as American Islam? There you go. So American Islam is this. American Islam is questioning the ideology and the theology of my forefathers, of my parents and my grandparents, of questioning what the imams and the scholars have been saying. Does it apply to Saudi living Muslims or does it apply to American Muslims? And when we as American Muslims, when we've started questioning what our forefathers have said, we can really go straight to, well, what did the Prophet Muhammad actually say? Let's skip what our forefathers have been saying to us, tradition passed down by word of mouth. Let's dive into the books. Let's read in the Arabic itself. And what did the Prophet Muhammad actually say? What does the Quran actually say? What does the English translation tell us about what Islam is? And that gives us as American Muslims a better idea of what Islam is. And that's very important for you to know. It's important for you to know because a lot of these things that you might see on TV, you might see that there's gender inequality. You might see, that Muhammad Ahmadinejad is denying that gays even exist. You might see stuff about, terrorism. You might see stuff about economy and how Muslims are fighting between one another. You have to understand that none of that cultural and nationalistic nonsense applies to Islam, and none of it applies to us as American Muslims. See, as American Muslims, still to this day, we have barriers in our mosque, where if you were to come into our mosque and pray as a Muslim, you, sir, would pray in the front, you, ma'am, would pray in the back, and there would be a wall behind you, a wall in between you. Now, you may say, oh my God, how can that happen in America? Well, to understand the immigrant experience, when you step in the shoes of an immigrant who came here knowing only that, and that is a part of Islam, well, naturally all the mosques, or most of the mosques in America, will have that. But see, as an American Muslim, practicing American Islam, which I would say is the closest to the type of Islam that the Prophet Muhammad 1400 years ago practiced, I would say that the partition has nothing to do with Islam, because maybe y'all don't know, but there's no partitions in the mosque. There's no barriers in the mosque. The Prophet Muhammad's wife was actually the Bill Gates of her time. She was one of the wealthiest women on the Arabian Peninsula. Women's rights were given to women at the earliest stage of Islam, they could inherit, they could own property, they could do business, they could travel independently, they could do pretty much whatever they want. In fact, at that time, women had more control in marriages than men did. And actually in my marriage too, right? We have to sign a contract. Our marriage is much like marriage in the Judaic culture, where marriage is essentially a business contract, right? And so my wife was able to write, well, he's going to have to do the cooking, he's going to have to do the cleaning, he's going to have to do this and that, and I had to sign it if I wanted to get married. Anyhow, so Muslims in Houston, we are going back to the roots of original Islam, of what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually preached, what he practiced, because we can say, okay, as an American Muslim, what is fact and what is fiction? What is fact and what is fiction? And we can dissect through it. And as a young community, actually, to be honest, I just found out I'm second generation Muslim, second generation American. I read last week as I was prepping for this lecture, I always thought I was first generation. But apparently my parents who immigrated here are first gen, I'm second gen, my son is third gen. So as a second generation Muslim, I can tell you that we are disseminating between immigrant Islam versus American Islam. And in doing so, as our community grows and grows and grows, what we really want you to do is to embrace the values that we're setting upon, which is all American ideals and American values, and ask us questions and find out who we are. And take the time to learn about what Islam is from a Muslim, rather than Dear Leader or Fox News, and just to ask us questions. Thank you very much for your time. I got the mark. I'm really sorry for going over. Thank you for having me.